Mom notices a little boy visiting the grave of her daughter until she finally realizes why. She walked away from the grave where she had recently buried her daughter. But then she noticed something strange. A small child walked past her on his way to her burial. What was he up to? As he passed, the small child grinned at her. She was trying not to overthink things. But then she saw something that triggered a profound reaction within her. The Macraes expected everything to be perfect all of the time. However, things would take a gloomy turn one day when their daughter, who had just turned 18, was involved in a terrible accident. Tammy sobbed when she learned about her daughter's demise. Things had been going so beautifully, and now her entire world was collapsing around her. Nothing would ever be the same again. Tammy married Chester right after graduating from high school. Junior year, they had eyes for one another, and by senior year, they were together. By college, the couple had a daughter, Lindsay, and were engaged. To top it all off, they had an incredible wedding that felt straight out of a children's fairy tale. Lindsay even got to lead the procession, and her parents couldn't have been happier. Years later, Lindsay had developed into a stunning young adult. Her parents were ecstatic about the woman she had developed into. She was a straight-A student and constantly tried to make everyone around her happy. No matter what, Lindsay would make sure to participate in it all. She was a fierce competitor who constantly sought to dominate. However, she surprised her parents one evening with something they didn't anticipate. She came home talking about wanting to sign some organ donation forms from the hospital she was volunteering at, she said. We thought it was a good gesture and encouraged her to do it. Lindsay was a bright young lady who never hesitated. She wasn't hesitating, and she quickly returned home with a donation card from the hospital. But they wouldn't lose her for long. Tammy recalls the event vividly. Her daughter was out with her best pals. They were on their way home from school when they were in a car accident and were rushed to the emergency room. Tammy froze as she heard the news, then her body went into overdrive, and she found herself speeding to the hospital. Tammy had just arrived in the emergency hospital when the physicians declared Lindsay deceased. The days that followed became weeks, with everything around Tammy and Chester losing color and intrigue. They had been devastated by their loss until that fateful week. It had been a few months since they had to say goodbye to their daughter. Tammy went to Lindsay's grave every day after work to help herself grieve. One day while she was walking away from the grave, Tammy observed a boy walking by. He was no more than 7 years old, with blonde hair, steel gray eyes and a little rucksack. He waved at Tammy as he passed by. He didn't think much of it at first but noticed something as the days passed. The following evening, Tammy ran into the same boy. She decided to at least try to figure out why the boy was always visiting the cemetery at that time of day. Tammy used her phone's camera to record the youngster as he walked to Lindsay's tombstone. He paused for a few seconds before sitting. Tammy stopped filming since the scene made no sense to her. She had no idea why the boy was standing close to her daughter's grave. Tammy approached the youngster and questioned whether he was one of Lindsay's friends, but he was too young to have known her daughter on such a personal level. I asked him if he knew Lindsay, and he said no, Tammy told a reporter from her town's local station. She also mentioned something about the youngster that left her in tears for days. He'd been battling a rare heart condition. After Lindsay passed, he obtained her heart through a transplant, which saved his life. But why was he going to Lindsay's grave every evening if he'd never met her? Where's your mom? Tammy inquired. He learned from his mom about Lindsay and what she'd done for him, and the past 2 weeks, he had been asking his mom to drive him to the cemetery to talk to Lindsay about his healing process, Tammy said with a tear in her eye. The little boy's mother was waiting for him in the parking lot. Tammy approached her and discovered what the little boy and his family had been through. Jane had been waiting for the proper time to call the Macrae family to convey her gratitude for their daughter's final selfless gesture, but she didn't want to approach them so soon after their loss. Meanwhile, she told Sam about the girl whose heart he possessed, and he insisted on seeing her at the grave. Finding the plot number was not difficult. But now she was face to face with Lindsay's mother. Tammy was overcome with emotion as she listened to Jane's story. After a few months, the grief of losing her daughter had dulled to a dull, heavy ache that she carried with her everywhere. Lindsay was everywhere she looked. The small boy in front of her was now carrying a bit of her and keeping it alive. She was at a loss for words. Tammy contacted the United Network for Organ Sharing to see who had received Lindsay's other organs. It was discovered that her daughter had saved 8 other people's lives with her organs on the day she passed away. 2 people had her lungs, another her liver, and others various other essential parts of her. Louise met all of them, but Sam, the tiny kid who had her heart, stood out the most.